Good evening and welcome to Out of the Bag. This is Sean Maguire live on Healing Oracle Radio and People's Internet Radio. And it is the 1st of the 4th, 2020, April Fool's Day. You can't catch me unless you got me before midday, so that's over with. Who are the fools? The ones staying at home or the ones in the hospital? Anyway, we won't go there. In the first 2 hours of the show, I will be playing a pre-recorded interview with the great Ken Scott. He is a co-founder of the Panterra Private Contract Association, as well as the initiator of the Gemstone University and Media Alliance concept. This is the 4th of a series of interviews that will hopefully give people enough knowledge and information to free themselves from the bonds that tie us to a psychopathic matrix of debt and slavery. And it is another insightful interview, and I really look forward to playing that for you in the first 2 hours. So without further ado, I'm going to get on and play my 4th interview with Ken Scott. Now, I say it's the 4th. I'm hoping that the information he will be giving over the next year, so once a month for the next year, will put us in a really, really good position. This interview also mentions, obviously, a little bit about what we're going through at the moment. So here it is, my interview with Ken Scott. And welcome to Out of the Bag. This is Sean Maguire live on Healing Oracle Radio and People's Internet Radio. And unfortunately, I'm doing a pre-record. Well, I say unfortunately, I'm doing a pre-recorded interview with Kenneth Scott. And unfortunately, we went through a half an hour and it didn't record, or the recording stopped halfway through and we didn't realise. So we're starting again. So this is a pre-recorded interview. It is the 29th of the 3rd, 2020. I'm with Ken Scott from Gemstone University.org and PanteraPCA.org. And I want to welcome you again, Ken.
Oh, yeah.
Back to Out of the Bag. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Happy to be here the second time today.
Yeah.
And happy to be here for our 4th session. So as we have been talking about, this session we are going to focus on bringing everything to the ground.
Yes.
Meaning we have been speaking in many areas, multidimensionally, and lots of things that many people can relate to, some maybe not, and it's too far out, and they want to know what's the nuts and bolts. What does this mean for me in practical terms? How can I do this in my life? And where do I start? What do I need to do?
Absolutely. People really, really are asking that question. I mean, where do they start especially? And I mean, people are, I suppose they're maybe in an abundant world, and they don't want to ruin that world, but they want to move into the society and to be sovereign. So how do they not end up by losing their abundance? They want to move into another abundant situation.
Right. Well, there are people who fall in that category, and there are people who are in the opposite, who are struggling, scrambling, maybe have real issues that they're challenged with. Obviously, the first one for most people is the financial issue, trying to achieve stability in their financial life. But others are struggling or having issues because they have legal issues, whether that's a tax issue or a court issue or a divorce, or, the various things that we in modern life create for ourselves. So there's a full spectrum. So there's really several layers to the answer. Layer 1 is universal, which we will get into. What are the universal, applicable to everybody on the planet elements of a starting point, where to go with it? And if that's your goal, if your goal is, I want to be free, I do not want to be contributing to the problem, I want to be part of the solution. If that's your goal, then we'll lay out a framework for that. So what are the universal applicable elements that are universal for everybody? Then there is, how do you evaluate for oneself? And that is key also, because as you were just saying, if somebody or a family has assets and they're doing well, and maybe they have a job that works or a business that works, what are their choices there? So we'll get into that.
Yeah.
But by and large, what I've found is in most cases, not necessarily all, but quite a lot, in most cases, where people are comfortable, they're financially sound, and their life is working, they've got a great job or whatever, they're not interested in changing that. But what has happened for many of the people, and again, I can only speak for the most part of the United States system and people, because that's where I live and that's who I've interacted with for my 30 years of being involved with this. Most of the time, it's an event or a series of events that pulls the rug out from under somebody's life, whether it's a foreclosure and they lose everything, or it's a, in the various collapses of the economic system, their individual financial structure collapses, they have a pension that just disappeared overnight, or they ran into tax troubles and they struggled and fought the IRS for years, or any variation of that. In most cases, people have been spun out of the matrix, and they're beat up, cut up, crawling and bleeding, and show up somewhere here or there and say, what happened? This is not what I expected. This is not what my life was about. And that was their wake-up call. We're dealing with them. We're dealing with individual cases.
Well, you've said in the half hour, unfortunately, that didn't record. My apologies about that. But you were talking about the history, the years you've been involved, and that some people go out onto the scene, if you like, and go and talk in seminars and start spreading their news, their I suppose their little gem that they're trying to get out there. But right. you haven't really done that. What you've done basically is to learn on the way, and as you said, 20 odd years of experience behind you. You'd meet someone who has only been in it 6 months and they're out on the circuit making
right.
money from it.
Right. Yeah. Well, the 20-year reference is that I made a little money here and there where people gave me a donation for helping them. But by and large, I knew I didn't know or understand in the complete comprehensive whole of how it really worked. And so I chose not to just do what I was doing to learn myself and perfect my true understanding, that until I really arrived there, I was not going to have people give me money in whatever form, whether I'm charging them for a process or now we do it on a donation basis with Panterra, until I really understood that I had something truly of value that was properly being exchanged for somebody giving me their hard-earned money. Yes. But as you were saying, in our first conversation, I was describing the process here in the U.S. Of people that I went and learned from and mentored from, and there were some pretty extraordinary people with knowledge, very advanced, and I learned tremendous amounts of things from many, many people. But then there were some who would just learn something, go out and make a lot of money, and not really give a thought to if this was really the right thing or if it was a solution. So there was that aspect in the continuum of the last 30 years. The other thing was that even those who are quite expert in a lot of ways, they didn't understand. Now, from my vantage point, looking backwards, what I know now, they didn't truly understand how the system really worked. Nice. And they went out and they taught, and many of them ended up going to jail. But then the other aspect was that, as you say, like, what I use that word, the circuit, that people would learn something. And in a lot of cases, they were successful in a court case or dealing with the tax issues or whatever. And in many cases, they were allowed to do that. They could have been taken down even with that particular case that they ended up winning. And this is not just speculation on my part. Do I have actual documentation to prove it? No, but this is based on 20 years of observation from the beginning of the 90s through the 2000, even 25 years, the middle of the 2010s, that somebody would be allowed to have a victory, and then they would go on the circuit, and they would do weekend seminars, and they would charge anywhere from $200 to $500 for a 2 or 3 week seminar. And in some cases, I paid as much as $5,000 for a 3-day seminar.
Wow.
Was it worth it? Yeah, I gained tremendous knowledge from those situations, or those encapsulated educational delivery mechanisms, but they weren't the whole picture. And I was after the whole picture. And what I did layer upon layer as I went through it over the years, I would learn something. I totally immersed myself in it. I would learn the system completely that was presented, whether it's the UCC or commercial process or administrative process, or how to do non-judicial liens, or all these different things. But when I could see, and I have had and have the ability to see where there's a flaw, that it doesn't have a completely whole system integrated answer to every piece of the puzzle, and where that was flawed, then I would finally see that. I'd move beyond it. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I learned from all that experience was that, my whole path, my whole mission in my life has been to come up with solutions. And I wanted a solution that was able to be accessed by anybody who was interested. And the flaw in that whole scenario of the circuit and weekend seminars and stuff is there was no continuity. People would go to these seminars, they'd learn something, they'd think they had the solution, they'd go back home where they were isolated, didn't have people to support them, correct them, guide them, or any of that, and that's where they got into trouble. Yeah. And then also where people were allowed to have a victory, and then they would teach it, and then they'd have thousands of people. It became a seeding and a harvesting of people, because the irony was that most of these people were very good intended, that they wanted to do something right and proper to bring forward freedom and stop the madness of the machine. And instead, actually, when they got arrested, they got charged, they had to fight it, and then bonds were attached to them, and those bonds were millions and billions. That was a harvesting of vast amounts of capacity to monetize all of that by the system they were actually trying to stop.
So Ken, the courts themselves would use these, I suppose, guys that went out on the circuit with their gem of information. They would let them through, in other words, as like a fly trap, and all the rest of them, they'd get caught.
Yeah, kind of like a honey trap. Yeah. But it wasn't the courts. You have to remember, everything's departmentalized. So the courts deal with judicial things, but then you have the law enforcement, you have intelligence, you have all these aspects of a coordinated, integrated, deep state system. So now, in these days, what we're watching the last few years since Trump took office, and everything has become really accelerated and really accentuated to expose what's happening. Now, this is something I absolutely knew was real and going on, for the last basically 40 years, that there was what people now would call a conspiracy, but it was more than a conspiracy. It was a deeply entrenched, systemic, historically evolved over thousands of years process towards global domination and control, to literally create a perpetual, eternal debt enslavement system based both on universal law and man's law, that all of humanity would be bound to and forever be just cattle on the plantation, to be domesticated, managed, and harvested. So now the deep state has emerged and has been exposed. But 10, 20, 30 years ago, you had to really understand what you were looking at and not get too caught up in rabbit trails and lost in bizarre conspiracies and stuff. But so it was a coordinated but compartmentalized machine.
Yes.
And so, but back to let's go back to ground,
yes,
where we started in the first conversation we had, which is, where does one start? You asked, you've had many people responding to our conversation say, well, that's all well and good, but how does this apply to me? Where do I start?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the starting point is education.
Education.
And then I believe I've said that before in the other three conversations, but it's very important to emphasize and really make it clear that the starting point is education, but the underlying foundation is one's own will and purpose and intent. Do you have the will to sustain a process of transformation in your life where you recognize, if what I have said and others that you've listened to have said, yes, we are all bonded, indentured servants, and as I describe it, bonded sureties to a bankrupt franchise in a perpetual debt system. If you recognize that's true, and then you have the internal passion that you want to be free of that, then you must have the will to sustain that. It's not something that happens overnight. It's not something that somebody just sends you a template, you fill in your data and you sign it, you send it somewhere, hey, I'm free. No, it takes persistence and consistency and a will of determination that you're going to move through this.
Yes.
And learn what you need to learn and integrate it. Because if you don't make it your own, well, Ken said that this and this, so that's all I need to know. But do you understand why Ken said this and this? Do you understand how it fits together? Do you have the capacity to see when something happens, whether it's a legal event, a lawful event, a monetary event, a macro scale global geopolitical event, or anything in between? Do you have the ability to stand in the center of that and understand how they correlate to each other? And within one's personal process, do you understand that if you take this step and you do this, do you understand why you're doing this? Do you know why then you do the next couple of things and how that relates to the way the system is constructed? All those things. So it takes the will and the intent to achieve the purpose, and the purpose being, I want to be free.
Are you saying don't do any of it until you know all of it? Or are you saying that there can be step-by-step learning on the way? Yeah,
it's a balance, and that's what I've designed and developed in Gemstone. The other thing that I did want to mention, which is important, is when I said that people would go to weekend seminars and stuff, there's no continuity, there's no guidelines that are continuous, there's no support, and I wouldn't say none, but it was very fragmented. Yeah. So it began to formulate, as I went through my years of all this study and everything that I've done, formulate in my mind what I wanted to create that was that had everything that was missing in the way it was being done before. Right. Does it have continuity? Does it have support? Are there guidelines? Is there interactive dialogue between other people going through the process? Can I, if I'm part of that society, learn from others who have gone before me? So that's part of the answer to your question, that yes, you can. It's a balance. Yes, you can. You don't have to do what I did and do 25 years. But there's a balance, and in what we have designed, and later in this conversation we'll get into where Panterra and Gemstone are at now and where we're going in the next 1 to 2 years, because it's quite significant and it relates to the answer of your question. How do people access this, how do people apply it, and do they have to just learn it all before they even take a step? So the answer is a balance between those. Right. Don't rush in headlong in the beginning, but no, you don't have to do things for years and years before you can apply it.
Right, that's good. Because, I mean, changing status from, the station we were born in to and being part of a bankrupt franchise, as you called it, I mean, it would be really important for people to know how they can become sovereign, what steps they need to remove those contracts, etc.
Yeah. Now, let me correct you there, because I don't use the word or the phrase "become sovereign." Okay. That's a bastardized word, and it's been used against people in the United States sovereign. And probably everywhere else, at least in the English-speaking world, like Australia and the UK. I imagine it's being used there now. It's been turned into this moniker called sovereign citizen.
Well, that's obviously wrong, isn't it? I mean, you can't have a citizen and be sovereign.
Well, that's correct. But the other thing is, by and large, what you're not after, quote unquote, is being sovereign. Okay. Now, in the grander scale, in the universe we exist in, every being who is an individuated expression of source or life in this universe, which includes obviously this planet, the foundational principle is that each individuated life being with consciousness is endowed with sovereign free will. So we are sovereign, but see, the system has been structured so that we all, through our sovereign free will, voluntarily have contracted and consented to be bound to the system. Right. So that's a fundamental starting point to understand that we are sovereign in that sense, in the true sense, ultimately. But legally, we're not aiming at sovereign status. What we're aiming at is solvent status. Mm-hmm. What is solvent? It's the opposite of bankrupt. Yeah. Because a bankrupt has no standing. You have no true ability to have ownership or title to anything. And people think, well, I'm not bankrupt. I have a job, a business, a house, a car. But you are bankrupt. Yeah. You are in a bankrupt system. Now, I say that based on everything I know from the last 30 years, based on everything that's been put in place the last 300 years. Mm-hmm. And again, we're going to put it to the second part of the conversation. But in fact, the entire global bankruptcy has just been closed out, literally last week.
That's interesting.
And this relates to what's going on in this global thing called a coronavirus and this pandemic and the lockdown and everything. So we'll put that down to, the last half hour of our conversation, but just keep that in mind.
I will, of course.
But even if the global system as a whole has now been resolved and has exited bankrupt status, we individually are still contractually bound to the franchise that was part of the bankrupt entity, and we took upon ourselves by voluntary consent the status of a bonded surety to a bankrupt franchise. So each one of us, our name that was registered as an account by the process of birth registration, creation of a vital record, a statistic account, and all of that is accumulated into from the state or province up to the national to the international level, and that is the backbone of the debt system. That creates a franchise. And we engage in commerce, which is everything that people know, from signing a bank account to getting a utility bill and having a job. Everything is commercial. And we attached ourselves to that voluntarily so that we can operate in commerce to eat and drink, buy and sell, earn a living, and all the rest of that. And by so doing, we attached ourselves to a bankrupt entity, and therefore we own nothing. It's held in a type of an estate, and we have no standing. So our goal in status correction is moving out of bankrupt status to solvency, where you disconnect from the entity that is actually not you. It's a creature of the state. It was created by the state, whichever state you're in.
Would that be the person, Ken?
It's the person, yeah. It's an artificial fiction and law person who was created by the state. So therefore it's property of the state. It was created within the rules of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction that controls bankruptcy. So we attached ourselves to it. Well, we were attached to it from days after our birth, but we've never rebutted that. We've never declared that we may have volunteered or consented, but it was out of ignorance and misunderstanding. And now I see that I made a mistake, and I'm declaring what my intention and status is, and I'm going to correct that mistake. Right. That's one of the first steps you do. Yeah. So back to the fundamental, making a firm decision within oneself, being committed to it, having the will to sustain it, and then finding the right place, which from my point of view is Panterra and the Gemstone University, because it's more organized, it's more systematized in terms of how to build a proper foundation of education in these key areas of law, money, and related things, so that you have that integrated knowledge that you've taken on and made your own, and you have all the other support and everything to move forward.
You've spoken about, obviously, PanterraPCA.org and Gemstone University. Are they? Do you think that they are okay across the board, universally, country-wise, I mean, or is it just specifically for America, and then we have to change things within it?
Right. Very good question. Very key and important question. So everything that I referred to in the status correction course and process that we have built inside Gemstone University is 99% United States oriented.
Yeah.
Okay. But because of the way the global world system is constructed, the United States is the center point of the global system, the global military occupation, the global bankruptcy, the global legal and monetary system. The Federal Reserve note as the U.S. dollar has been the reserve currency in every central bank on the planet since basically the late 1940s. Yeah. So learning, and we have members who are in Canada, Australia, South Africa, Namibia, UK, and I'm naming all Commonwealth countries. And we also have members who are in the Roman civil law system, which is primarily Europe and Latin America. Yeah. So you really have three systems that are important to understand as far as the law form. You have the United States of America, which does have, since its inception, the ability for, at the beginning, free white men holding land to be the sovereign and have the standing in law to have that status. But we can transform that within our own private jurisdiction within Panterra to include all beings, universally, women, other races, and so forth. So that's not an impediment, but it is a foundational part of the U.S. system that's important to understand is unique. So we have the U.S. system, but post-World War II in bankruptcy and creating the globalization of things, all other countries were converted from sovereign countries to national corporations. Yes, those corporations all channeled through Washington, D.C., so they're all essentially subdivisions of the United States corporation. So learning the United States fundamentals in law and money mechanics and so forth, as it relates specifically to status correction or one's personal status, 90% of it, roughly, guesstimating a percentage, is universal and applies to every country. Now then you go to the next two levels of distinction, one being the English law Commonwealth countries, of which there are 5 major ones, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Mm-hmm. But there's about 143 is, I think, the number, Commonwealth countries that were within the British Empire and still operate on English law, like Bahamas and Belize and Kenya and Sierra Leone and, all those countries. Mm-hmm. So what we are doing now, and we have been for a couple of years, we have about, I think, 40 members, 50 members maybe in the Commonwealth countries who have been studying with us, learning all those principles, learning the universal aspects of the U.S. system that apply everywhere. And we have been converting the status correction process to how it would be applicable and be able to be used in the Commonwealth countries. Mm-hmm. The third step, or the third layer, is countries that operate under Roman civil law, which is Europe, and then Latin America. Right. But again, also, though, it's sort of a mirroring, because basically the matrix, the bonded system, is all under civil law. So let me see if I can explain this succinctly and properly to see what I'm describing. We have a mirroring effect because the United States started with its foundation in law, where the sovereignty was actually vested in the people, and but it progressively was moved into a corporate structure. Nice. And into a bankrupt structure that was a under military occupation, and bankruptcy operates in civil law, civil procedure, because the bankrupt body politic is put into a status called the civitas, or the civil body. And the procedure to maintain bankruptcy or military occupation is international in function and jurisdiction, and that is Roman civil law. So even though America has the foundation of, you can return to that status of, basically solvency and standing on the land with law and essentially a sovereign status, it has an overlay through military conquest and bankruptcy in Roman civil law. The same is true with all the Commonwealth English law countries. The original countries that still operate in Roman civil law are the countries that were conquered by Rome, 2,000, 1,800 to 2,200 years ago. That's all of Europe. Yeah. So they have always been in military occupation. So whatever Europe thinks itself to be, free, Western open mode of society, it is a military occupied system since 2,000 years ago. Same is true for Latin America, because Latin America was conquered by the Spanish. And starting soon after Columbus did his thing in 1492 into the early 1500s, the position of Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which is creating the Roman civil law system, it shifted to the King of Spain. Right. So as all of Latin America was conquered and then settled and eventually became independent, it still was under military conquest and hence under Roman civil law. So this is why you have to understand where you are. You can't say, well, I'm in America and I'm free and God damn it, the government's the enemy and I have to take them down, or any variation on that. You have to just know I'm standing where I'm standing. I have the potential to take steps to truly be solvent, to be free, but I'm wrapped with civil procedure and bankruptcy and military occupation, and I need to know how that works before I can take the steps and have the ability to stand on it to remove that wrapping. But in practical terms, it's probably going to take us several more years to perfect everything we know for the American system and get it integrated, procedurally sound, and functionally deliverable in terms of education and proper documents and steps to take for first the Commonwealth countries and then the Roman civil law countries. But to begin your journey, if you're listening to us and you want to be, achieve the goal of being free from bondage and slavery and debt and all the rest, education is your starting point.
It is, absolutely. And so what you've just said really is that even now, Gemstone University is an evolving education system.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It took me 30 years to know what I know. So if somebody thinks that, I want it delivered in 6 weeks, well, it's not going to happen. But there's other aspects of what Pantera as a global private society is and what we're doing right now, which is real work in action, making this real. Because it's not just about personal freedom. It's about global liberation. We are a globally occupied planet over millions of years. There are levels of occupation and hidden control that precede all the history we think we know. United States to Rome to Egypt and Babylon. No, we have been under essentially the same thing, a system of bondage, military occupation, and slavery for millions of years.
Yeah.
So our real goal is to work together and to systemically and systematically begin to build healthy communities and countries that progressively are freeing people. And what's the thing that people are most enslaved by? They're enslaved by poverty, disease, starvation, lack of resources, lack of community infrastructure, lack of education, and all of that. And this is what Pantera's true committed mission really is. It's to be a on-the-ground, purposeful part of a solution that is actually going to help this world be free.
So like to build a new world system, but without any flaws?
Well, I wouldn't say without any laws. I'd say
flaws, I said.
Based without any what?
Flaws.
Flaws, yeah. Well, I think there'll be a few flaws here and there for a very long time. I mean, that's... yes, the answer is yes. But what is real healing? Healing is the individual, and it can only happen if the individual chooses to heal him or herself. But then again, lots of people out there would like to heal themselves, but they're wrapped by all kinds of control mechanisms, or the worst control, which is 4 billion plus people on the planet are controlled by the lack of resources, lack of education, and lack of ability to change their lives. So it's going to take much more conversation than just 1-2 hour conversation. Maybe we'll frame it out in this conversation, and then the next time we meet in a month, I'll go into more detail, because Pantera does have the ability, both sort of, first and foremost, jurisdictionally. We firmly established our jurisdictional integrity. Secondly, we have been actively in the process for well over a year in establishing relationships with governments on the planet who are in need of outside help, financially speaking, as well as knowledge and implementation. And we are building something that is quite extraordinary. We're working collaboratively with a lot of alliance partners and associations. So what Panterra is and Gemstone is not just about what we've talked about so far, personal freedom or status correction. That's part of it. But we have a much bigger mission statement and purpose, which is to actually do real work in the real physical world and not be hypothetical or philosophical or, angry about, this world and the government and all the bankers and all this and that, no, we choose to focus on what we can do as real solutions in a unified way, because we can't do it onesie-twosies. And so we have been building foundations and templates or models of how we can actually accomplish something real in the real world.
Yeah, look, it's incredible the work you're doing as well, and I'm so glad that you're able to come on the show once a month to explain all this to us, Ken. It's brilliant. I really do think that we have, I've got people asking me questions that I don't even know whether they are relevant or not. One of them specifically, and it came from more than one person, so they must be discussing it or getting together about it. But they said, how can we become recognised as an ethnic nation? Does that make any difference?
Great question. Okay. So let's lay the foundation for that question. Okay. The foundation is, what do we know about taught history? Meaning, what did we learn in the history classes we went to school, and is generally accepted as the universal truth that, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, blah, 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 and things like that. Well, what we were taught was that there was this great organizing, civilizing force that emerged out of Europe, specifically Rome, but European Christian nations like Spain, like England, like France, like Portugal, but they were all operating under the coronated crown issued from Rome. And it's interesting, we have a coronavirus going around the world. Well, corona means crown, and it's based on the esoteric system of sun symbology and worship going back to Egypt. That was all the sun god and Amen-Ra and all that kind of stuff. And what happens when you have a solar eclipse and the moon eclipses the body of the sun, you see the corona, and that's considered the crown. So it's all symbolic, esoteric, and everything. But the bottom line is that the Pope crowned the kings of Europe. They then had this so-called authorization that emerged from the early 1300s through the 1500s by various stages of papal decree, and is commonly known collectively as the doctrine of discovery. Mm-hmm. You're familiar with that, Sean?
Indeed, yes. Yep.
And issued these different papal bulls in 1455 and 1493 and 1535 or something like that, that basically said that anywhere that a captain of a ship carrying a flag of a crowned sovereign out of Christian Rome would place that flag on land, that flag and that crown then, by virtue of quote-unquote discovery, owned that land and simply had to subdue everybody on that land to subjugate them to our authority. Yeah. And what was that called? It was called, for one, the Age of Conquest. So what are we talking about when I talked earlier about Roman civil law? We talk about military conquest. Yes. So in their system of martial law and conquest and all the rules that they've promulgated, you can acquire land through trade, through acquisition, purchase, or conquest. And of course, their favorite is conquest. Mm-hmm. So they conquered lands, subjugated them, and what did they do with the people? They civilized them. Again, they moved them into this containment field according to Roman civil law or Roman laws in general, and they civilized them or made them part of the civil body. That civil body has been lifted off the land and has no grounding on the land, and in our world system, standing or status on the land is everything. That gives you the substance of law and the capacity to direct your own destiny and things like that. So all of those tribal units that you could call, ethnic nations or whatever. And I avoid the word nation because that's another bait and switch. That's another false floater. But call them tribes. Call them the tribes of man, the tribes of this world. There's thousands of them. They're all either subjugated and what's the word? Can't think of the word where they're integrated into quote unquote society, or they're subjugated and just basically on the edge of survival through genocidal, racial genocide and so forth. They are dispossessed from the land. So there's a lot of background how I can describe and lay the foundation, how we actually have the ability and capacity to assist working in partnership or in alliance with all those peoples, all those tribes. I'm not going to get into that in this call, but either the next call or in 1st of May or the 1st of June, I will introduce that. But suffice it to say that there is answers, and that is, it still starts back in the law, understanding everything we talked about, and assisting them to, and a lot of them have been pursuing it for many years, whether that's the Kingdom of Hawaii or all the North American tribes that have been learning law and trying to apply it, or Australian Aboriginal or original people. But it's flawed. They don't know what they need to know. And most importantly, they don't have a jurisdictional enclosure that will absolutely protect them from all the vicissitudes and the collateral attacks that is common and constant in their attempts to regain their sovereign status on their own land. I can just definitively tell you, we do have the answer to that. And I'm not going to talk about this call. We'll talk about it over the next 1 to 3 conversations. But leave it at that.
I was specifically asking, Ken, because, I'm in Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland. We're not in the UK. And our peoples, if you like, have been, since St. Patrick came over, so that was the Romans, and then the British, of course. We've been in a certain position, and then, as you mentioned, papal bulls. I think it was Pope Adrian was the first English pope, and he gave Henry V the Irish people as a gift.
Right.
And we want to go back to there and go, no, you didn't. Okay. Yeah.
And we can. I'm certain that we have the ability to achieve that, but we're talking about, basically a 10 to 20, maybe 25-year trajectory. My goal, my stated goal, is to be part of the liberation of all people on this planet. I've done 30 years of deep research to understand the law and the world system. I've done what was necessary to put Pantera in a position to have both the knowledge, but also the resources and the jurisdictional position, not just with what Pantera is as an individual private society, but in strategic alliance with other very key sovereign bodies politic, working in synergy. And that's what we have to do. Stop fighting amongst ourselves and come together. But the always will come back. The grounding to come together, the starting point is real education. To know that kind of thing, like what you said for the Irish people, but to know the same thing for the African people, same thing for the Australian original people, or the North American original people, etc. But I will say a statement that may seem really outrageous, but I'll just simply say we do really know how to do this. And we are at a staging point, because what is happening on the planet right now with the so-called virus is only a front sort of public perception event, behind which there are things happening that are fundamentally transforming the entire world and will make it very real and very possible for us to move forward in achieving that goal.
So are these good things rather than bad things happening? Right, okay.
They're absolutely good things. They're absolutely good things.
Because I've been hearing so much, of course, about what's been going on with the coronavirus, and I've got, one neck of the woods, if you want, one end of the spectrum saying it's the end of the world, we're going to lose millions and millions of people, billions in fact. And then on the other end, it's, don't worry, when we come out of this, there'll be lots of good things in place that we can work with.
Yeah. Well, the sober reality and the truth of it is it's really some of both, because, there are going to be a lot of people who don't have the biological, physiological strength to resist it, and yes, people will die. But people die every day. People die in the hundreds of thousands from flu. So yes, that's going to happen. But at the same time, yes, absolutely. There are things that are already, and we can talk a bit about it during the rest of the conversation. There are things already happening that are unprecedented, monumental, but most people, almost all people, can't see it because they don't have the, they don't have the, can't take time. You can't know the players without the scorecard. When I used to go to baseball games, get your scorecard here. You don't know the players without the scorecard. People don't know who the players are. A lot of people are just literally having wholesale quantum collapse of their picture of reality because things are not going the way they think they are, and they don't know who is who. But that's going to start unraveling and being made clear over the next year or so. If you're slightly in the know, Ken, I mean, when's it going to end? Is it going to be so soon? I mean, I was told that it was very soon that it's going to end, and that it's like it's never been here before, and then it was going to return again in a couple of years' time or 10 years' time to do the same thing again. Yeah. Well, first of all, let's start from the beginning. We're talking about a artificially manipulated or genetically modified biological organism that has been weaponized. Yes. And has been used as a weapon in a continuing battle that has been raging on the planet for decades, that is culminating right now. And this is its last hurrah. It's Hail Mary. I don't know if you know the phrase in U.S. American football. You know that phrase, a Hail Mary pass? I do know it. I've heard of it. Okay, well, just for the listeners, in case they don't know what that means, if it's the fourth quarter, which is the last quarter, and each quarter is, 12, I don't really follow it, but it's either 12 or 15 minutes, and the clock is running down, and one team is behind, 6 points, and if it got a touchdown, it would get 7 points and win the game, but it's on its own 3-yard line or 15-yard line. It's got the whole field to go, and there's only, a minute left on the clock. They do a Hail Mary pass, which basically means pray that it gets caught and you get a touchdown. And the quarterback sends a 60-yard pass, hoping that his receiver gets it, catches it, and runs for a touchdown because they got one play left, and that's it. Well, the coronavirus, as you're watching it unfold, is the Hail Mary of the dying and already defeated, collapsed deep state cabal, whatever you want, the nemesis of this world, the entrenched evil that is so psychopathic that it will kill everything it needs to get its goal of complete domination and control of this world. So you're not watching something that's on the ascendant, that's going to ravage this world and all of its people. You're watching a impotent attempt of a dying cabal to thwart something that they have no ability to stop. And in fact, it's so far in place that it's already an accomplished fact that they have been truly sequestered, isolated, defeated, and they are in the process of being dismantled. And we can look at that on a physical level with the geopolitical and banking and monetary structures, or we can, say that on a multidimensional level. But what we're going through, you could describe or liken to a healing crisis.
I really hope you're right, Ken. I really do hope you're right. So much doom and gloom out there, and what you're saying is very, very positive, and it does err on the side of what we're hoping to be happening. I really do hope that the cabal are in their death throes, and that is the last throw of the dice for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are you familiar with healing processes and what a healing crisis is?
Well, you can explain it.
Okay. Well, it's applicable to any modality, whether you're doing herbs or supplements or different things that don't suppress symptoms. Most pharmaceuticals just suppress symptoms. They don't cure anything. But if you want a systemic, deep, full clearing and healing, you basically must go after something at the core, the root of it. And because it is at various levels, I'm talking about if a body has a disease or a dysfunctionality or whatever it is, and in homeopathy, which is the classic area where you refer to a healing crisis, homeopathy is an energetic form of medicine that stimulates the body to heal itself. And it will bring all the symptoms up so that it seems like it's a full-blown reactivation of the disease. But in fact, it's the disease being expunged or pushed out of the body by the body's own healing ability and mechanisms, stimulated or supported by a stimulant or an activator like a homeopathic remedy or a process and so forth. And so the symptoms will appear to be accelerated and full blown. Yeah. But once you pass through that, the actual disease component or the weakness in the body or the infiltration of a parasite or whatever is actually cleared out of the body. Right. That's what we're going through on a planetary level.
Okay, so things get worse before they get better, basically.
Correct. Yeah. So let me just fundamentally define something. You've got what seems to be an extremely over-the-top reaction with locking down virtually the entire planet, socially and economically, where dozens of countries are locking and quarantining their entire population, bringing regular business almost to a screeching halt. And everybody who's out there as a prognosticator or maybe a truly educated professional financial or economic monetary authority is saying, this is it, this is the collapse. The whole monetary system was a Ponzi scheme and it's collapsing. Well, that's true. But what they're not seeing is the other half of it, that there's something new being birthed and being brought forward and is going to infuse exactly what needs to be done to shift into a new global system that will be not in the control of the banks and the elite and the former powers that be. It will progressively and systematically be something that truly will enable, like what I said earlier, dedicated and committed groups like the Panterra Society and many more around the planet to start bringing forward real work in the real world, new technologies to clean up the environment, to start healing people in large numbers, to start actually implementing solid social and economic foundations that a country can actually start building itself out of extreme poverty without it being constantly undermined by systemic global corruption. So, and again, I can't go into the detail now, and we will over the course of probably this whole year. But I will absolutely tell you that there's a new kid on the block, so to speak, and he's not a bully. He's there to support the rest of the kids on the block and empower them to strengthen their ability to heal their lives and help each other. And, it's pretty simple. It's a phrase that I coined 25 years ago, and many people have coined their own phrases, variation on it. But my phrase is simply, that which is broken can never be fixed. Yeah. That which is real can never be broken. What's real here is the original template of life and how life can always heal itself, and how, given the opportunity and removing the shackles from it, life is stronger than any disease or any parasite or anything like that. And all we have to do is focus on it, because we are creating it through our directed will and consciousness. So focus on what's real, not continuing to be caught in a binary polarity of an enemy that, it's them. It's always the enemy. And we've talked about that before in our other conversations, but that's also fundamental too. You must release the enemy projection that there's something outside of ourselves that has more power and weapons or whatever, more money, that we'll never get out from under it. Yeah. For as long as we keep focusing on that, it becomes real, or even though it's broken and can never be fixed. So focus on what's real, which is principles of life and universal law and balance and abundance. And we actually have the ability now, because we are in a new system right now that is birthing, and we will have the ability and the resources to focus on actually healing this world. And that's the work before us.
Well, that sounds absolutely fantastic. I mean, the system that exists right now, or rather the system that did exist before this, it's the one that's kept whole nations in slavery, whole nations in debt. And without that usury that's been used throughout the economic systems on this planet, these countries have been plummeted into debt and plummeted into famines and all the rest of it, and poverty. So wouldn't it be great to get rid of the Bank of England and Washington DC and the Vatican and all the other banks that go with them?
Yeah, but we're not going to get rid of them necessarily. This is not a war point counterpoint where you have to vanquish the enemy in a physical sense of it. I mean, the fundamental is a shift in the law and the money system and who controls it. Yeah. Washington D.C. will still be functioning for a long time to come. So will the Vatican and so forth, because at the higher sense of it, they're not our enemies.
But they have usury within their systems, and usury is our enemy, surely.
Well, it's not, and again, it can be semantics, but there's an energetic quality. When you have an outside enemy, you are in a polarity with that enemy. Okay. And you will be eternally attached to that enemy for as long as you are projecting that it's an enemy. If you remove that, and it's what I call the enemy construct, which is an internal stance or position relative to my reality, or each one of our own reality. Nice. When you stop seeing anything outside of you as an enemy, you start gaining an energetic strength and real power to direct the energy that you have towards building something. And that which is corrupted, that which is without any sense of other, any sense of, the greater good and so forth, in the process that's going to continue to unfold and accelerate in this world, it will self-destruct.
Yeah.
It is already in the process of self-destructing. If you look at those so-called external enemies, whether it's a church or Washington, D.C. or the, bankers or whatever, they are already in an advanced stage of self-destruction. We don't have to do anything to facilitate that. We just simply have to remove our attachment to it. And when we remove it, you truly are empowering yourself. When we see something outside of us that is posited as an enemy, it's disempowering. It's putting our power into that enemy.
Right. Yes. No, I see that. The private society, Panterra Private Society, does it? What's the word I'm looking for? Does it encapsulate everything one needs? Or rather, what am I trying to say? Do you need to keep the outside world the way it is, or will you be, I suppose, cutting the strings of all that, and everything that you need is within the Private Contract Association?
Well, it isn't yet, and it's a long time before it would be. But again, based on what we just talked about. Yeah. We don't see the outside world as separate from us. So, right. We're all in it together. And it kind of, it's an aspect, or it's built on that phrase, be in the world, but not of it. Right. Let's redefine that. Be in the matrix, but not of it. Well, what's the matrix, and how am I in the matrix? This goes back to the fundamentals of removing yourself from it. Yeah. Can I operate in the matrix and not be of it, part of it? Yes. Well, we can look at what I've described as a bankrupt franchise that we're attached to by voluntary contract as the bonded surety, which means we're the debt servicer. We're the bankrupt. We are attached to the debt and all of its negative ramifications. But so it is like an avatar, like in video games. You project an avatar, or the movie The Matrix. They're in the real world on this ship called the Nebuchadnezzar, and through the mechanisms of jacking in and the phone and everything, they project an avatar. Looks like you, acts like you, but it doesn't. It's only the form. It doesn't have the substance or the living being of you in it. So how do you be in the world without being of it? How to remove the attachment to that avatar and reconfigure your relationship to how do you operate in the world through a new avatar. And we do have the means and the formula to do that. And so going back to your original question, and I don't know if it was in our recorded call now. By the way, did you check the recording? Are we still good?
We're still good. We're still good. And my apologies to everyone else. We had a great half-an-hour chat before this one, didn't we?
Yes, we did. But we've covered it all. And so I'm remembering a few key points to bring in. So, and I think it was in the original 30 minutes that didn't get recorded that you asked a question, or people have been asking you, well, what if I have good things in my life? I have assets, I have a house or whatever, and I have a business, and I don't just want to collapse it all and lose what I've built. Yes. to quote unquote correct my status. I may be a bonded surety, but I'm enjoying life, There are ways to translate what one has created into a holding structure that can be operated and function on the private side, the living side. So we can talk about the matrix, and we can talk about being having status and standing in having corrected the status, or we can also talk about it, as I've mentioned before on our calls, as a dividing line between the public and the private. The public is that self-contained civil body in commerce, in bankruptcy, and all the rest of it. And the avatar that we operate through when we go into the matrix is a commercial person. Like you said, it's a franchise of the corporate entity, whether that corporation is the United Kingdom, the United States, or any of the others. It's a national corporation, and it created a avatar that we accepted to use to operate in the matrix. So when we do that, we are in the matrix and of the matrix. We're one and the same. Yes. Can we transform that to have a private standing where we have a grounding in life rather than death? Because that public system is entirely built as a cult of death. And everything we do in it is a pledge of death. We are literally bending our knee to the Grim Reaper and to death. Yes. And we are contributing our energy and our life force every single day in sustaining death. And we can see the outpictured result of that, which is 4 to 5 billion people living on the edge of survival. Yes. And then a few other billion people they may be surviving, but they're still in dead-end life situations or quasi-enslaved jobs and so forth. It's not what you would call life. So as long as we operate by and through their avatar, we are in the matrix and of the matrix. Can we remove not only ourselves, but our life work and our substance and operate in the private, in the land of the living, or on the land of the living? Yes, there is a lawful and legal way to do that. In order to understand the law of how that would work, you have to understand how jurisdiction works. Yes. You have to understand how contract works. You have to understand how holding entities such as corporations or LLCs or trusts or foundations or associations, how each one of those work and how they relate to contract and jurisdiction. And how do you move something that's held in a public entity like a corporation and move it into a different holding structure. And then if you've got that holding structure and you've moved your assets or you've moved your individual being and corrected its status, how then do we return to being able to be in the matrix but not of it? How can we operate functionally and not just go live in a cave or live in a car where we can say, oh, yeah, I'm free, but, oh, you're free. Can you do anything? Well, yeah, I get up in the morning, I go around and relieve myself on the bush, and I go back in my cave. Oh, well, that's a nice life. Enjoy it. But how do we actually live a life that's truly free, that still functions within this world because there's still billions of people in the matrix? How do we work and create and build wealth or value that's going to be helpful to doing projects, as I said we're here to do? How do you do that? Well, that's an educational process. I can't answer that in one conversation, but that's what we have built on Gemstone, and we're just about to expand the availability of that, which we can get into in a minute. Okay. But there is the knowledge, the awareness, and the ability to remove oneself and one's functionality out of being in and of the matrix to where you have the choice to operate in a private reality and go back into the public or in the matrix if and as you require, right, without reattaching yourself. That's a knowledge that I've built. That's a knowledge that I've conveyed to our hundreds of members, and now we have a strong base to start educating more people who wish to know how to do that. That is
vitally important, isn't it? I mean, for people to be able to dip in and out of the society within the system that already exists as well. It's really important. Otherwise, you are that man in the cave, you know?
Right, exactly. And I will tell you straight out, in my experience of the last, especially the last 5 to 7 years, I have interacted with every major boogeyman or enemy, as people will call it, in the system.
Okay.
Seamlessly and with no problem. I make them my friends. They are not my enemy. I work side by side with them, so to speak, in terms of operating and functioning as a private society. What do I mean by those enemies, or what people would like to project as the enemies? Well, who's the biggest one in the States? The IRS. Then there's the SEC and the FBI and these other, and local police, or the police officer on the street. Yeah. Ultimately, everything I'm talking about, how to educate yourself, how to apply that education, how to live sustainably in that transformed life or reality, it's all about going to peace. The public commercial system is built on principles of war. Yes. And so if we all grew up in the 60s and 70s, and some in the 80s and so forth, and said we're against war, my generation protested the Vietnam War, but we have war after war after war, now in Iraq and everywhere else. But if we say the only solution for humanity is to not be at war, to be at peace. Yeah. Well, if I said that every single day when you engage in commerce, you are at war. Yes. It's built as a system of war. So how can you say, without being a hypocrite, I'm not here to support or in any way be in war, when every day that's what you're doing? Mm. So our fundamental principle, both as a society and then on the individual level, is go to peace. Move your life internally, and then it will reflect externally, being at peace. And I've had interactions with all those entities I've described. I've had IRS come to my door. I've had police come to my door. I've had the SEC come to my door. I've had other members of ours have had the FBI come to the door. And we immediately disarm, essentially, by not being reactive, not being polarized, not projecting the enemy outside of ourselves. Oh, these guys are my enemy, I have to fight them, but being at peace. And it is almost instantly transformative. Yes. When they realize that, and they realize that you are not at war with them or who they work with and for, and that you're there to cooperate, you're there to settle matters, whatever they may be. You have the ability to settle those matters, whether it's a court-ordered judgment or a tax bill or whatever, and that when you settle it, it actually satisfies their legal and financial requirement. Therefore, you're not a tax protester, you're not a belligerent, you're not an enemy combatant. Yeah. And when you have that standing internally, and you can live it real time with these people who are human beings who are working what they feel is a right job for them, and they don't know any different, and you cooperate, that it transforms the situation every time. And then they actually cooperate with you and help you settle the matter that you're there to settle.
Yeah, I just wish it worked that way all the time. Do you ever come across, I suppose, competitive-natured people within, like, the police or whatever, who don't want to be at peace with you?
Well, there are certainly those who are there. Yeah. But you asked, do I ever? So far, in my experience, going really 30 years, and I've had a few, tense situations, but by and large, especially the last 8 or so years, when I really understood this and I understood what I was doing, and I built a comprehensive solution-based education and application system for myself and others, the answer is no. The people would show up. I lived in a city for 10 years over this period. More like 6.5, but we we had the home for 10 or 11 years. And I went through many processes in dealing with that, with the banks and otherwise, but also the county officers and the sheriff and the police and so forth. And one day I had 2 task force officers show up at the door, and they were there to investigate, are you a sovereign citizen? And they were friendly, but they were professionals to do their job. And I spent an hour talking with them, and they walked away bouncing and smiling. And I had said, because I educated them, and I said, this is how it really is. And I said, not only am I not what you're looking for, but I'm here to help and cooperate for you to learn and understand how the law really works, so that when you work with other people, you will have the ability to properly situate the situation so that it works for everybody's well-being. And I have spent time with them since then, and I'm educating them. I'm also through them an FBI agent who's in the conversation, and I'm actually educating them how the law works and building a basis to extend that over time so that we can educate and transform those systems that have been created as polarization so that they're the authority and we're the enemy. Because that's how the system was set up, that the people are the enemy.
Yes.
And they're belligerents and they're enemy combatants and all of that. But we can transform that. And with the events that are happening now that I've referred to, the foundation to do that, not only in the States but worldwide, will start building and accelerating so that the power, I grew up with John Lennon singing "The power is in the people," power to the people. The power for and of the people is not to fight and be at war with the system. The power is to transform our internal relationship and have true power where we can transform those who previously were posited or put in our reality as our enemy. Yeah. The force behind creating that has now been totally, I didn't want to say, they have been defeated. It has been a war, but they've been defeated. Right. They're not going to be there anymore. Right. And we have that power now. So we can be self-disempowering by seeing an enemy that controls us or will always put us in dysfunctional or limited lifestyles and all that, or we can say, you know what? No, we are actually the power here. We are the creator of this reality. We made a mistake by focusing our creational capacity into a dysfunctional machine at war with not only the people but the planet and life itself. Yeah. So I made that mistake. I contributed to that. Now I've corrected that mistake. I'm redirecting my focus. I'm taking my power and authority back, and I'm going to direct that power to life and creation and healing and everything that we need to do to transform this world back to what it was supposed to be in the first place.
Brilliant. Look, I mean, obviously I've got questions coming in from people in the UK, etc. Two questions in particular. The CESTKV Act, how it affects us as individuals, and can you explain the Live Life claim?
Okay, I've never heard of the phrase Live Life claim.
Okay.
So we can come back to that, but let's talk about CESTKV Act.
That's it, yeah.
Okay. Pardon?
That's it, the CESTKV Act, yes.
Yeah. All right, so let's define that for everybody listening who may not know what that is. In English history, we have since 1066, when William from Normandy came over and took control of basically the British Isles, or at least the beginning point of taking control over that, and started a succession of different dynasties. The Plantagenets, that's the right way to pronounce them, which were the French, and then the Tudors, and then the then the Germans move in with the Hanoverian lines, which we still have today. So there's different segments. And so then English law was established. We have the Magna Carta established in 1215, which was only for the peers, those who were granted titles as peerage who had land and were in a bonded oath of fealty with the sovereign or the king or the crown to do what they were required to do when called upon to do them. So you have the system which was already in place or implemented by the time you have the Magna Carta. And it's a system of landed estates and titled estates. So when you have earls and barons and dukes and the other titles, you have a continuum of a title holder that moves from one period to the next period, but there's a continuum of that estate being retained as a whole estate. And that estate is basically vested in the land. And so you have a relationship with the title holder and the land and all of the things that have then created the system of aristocracy and the elites and all the rest of it. They then became the mechanism when in the early 1600s, the crown started creating royal charters and royal companies like the Hudson Bay Company and the South Africa Company and the East India Companies. There were two, and the Virginia Company and so forth. They went out as commercial vessels, going around the world and extracting massive amounts of wealth that continued to build the strength of the crown and the landed estate holding aristocracy. So that all boils down to one thing, which is called an estate. So all property on this planet is held in estates. That's why you call a national organization a state. So the United States is a state. UK is a state. Australia is a state. They then were converted from sovereign bodies to national corporations, and then those national corporations were put into bankruptcy. But all along, it all was based on one fundamental, which is that all property is held as an estate. Okay?
Yeah.
So by definition, an estate has a beneficiary or multiple beneficiaries. But in what we're talking about with titled estates, there was only ever one beneficiary who was always the firstborn son. That's why the estates always went to the first son and not split up proportionately. Yes. Like now we have, parents who give their estate through will, and they say, my 4 children get an equal quarter share. Yes. Okay, they couldn't do that because if they did that, it would break it down into smaller, less controllable and less functional fragments. So the Sestakay V Act was about how to move an estate through a living beneficiary if the beneficiary was lost at sea. Yes. So first let's define Sestakay V. Are you familiar with that term?
I am, but you can explain it.
Okay, well, let me ask you, how do you understand it? What does it mean?
Well, it is supposed to be, all I know is from the fire of London, and that people were claimed as dead, and they had to prove, so that's really what my understanding of it. Okay.
Well, it does relate to the fire of London because that's happened in 1665 and basically cleared the real estate so that they could rebuild the city of London in the form and everything that we see there today. And of course, they love numbers, and so they love that number 666. So there's no accident that it was done in 1 followed by 666. And it's all about binding the flesh of man. Okay. So, you look at the Bible reference, the number of man, 666. Well, there's hidden esoteric structures behind that. There's mathematical and numerological structures behind that number. It is a very interesting and unique number, but everything is in co-relationship or correspondence with everything else. So you have a hidden esoteric meaning to numbers and how those operate through the control mechanisms of the world, but you have a reflection of that in the real physical world. So people say, oh, 666, that's the number, that's the devil. But it actually says the number of man. Why does it say the number of man? Because of the hidden numerological attachments as well as the physicality of our bodies. Yes. Our bodies are carbon. Carbon is the sixth element on the chart. Periodic chart. It has 6 neutrons, 6 protons, and 6 electrons. There is a correspondence to the real physicality of our embodiment as living beings in physical form in this world. So it is all about attaching their hidden numerological esoteric system to our flesh, which also goes back to what we talked about, the doctrine of discovery and the original papal bulls in 1302 and onward, because that is all summed up in one thing, one statement, which is the Pope basically said, I declare that all land, all flesh, and all souls belong to me, right. Essentially, right. And it is, in standardized language, he basically said, well, I'm the vicar of Christ because I have this apostolic succession, so I have this divine right by all of that storyline to hold this position, the throne of Peter, and I'm the vicar of Christ, which means vicarious, which means the stand-in or replacement of. So for as long as Christ doesn't come back, I get to claim all this world for him, but if he doesn't come back, well, I'll just own it forever, or my succession, the never-ending papacy that posited that it would own all land, all flesh, and all souls. So to achieve that, there had to be a mechanism to claim and control all land, to lift all the people, the true people, the original peoples who were stewards in co-resonance with the planet itself. And by and through that stewardship and resonance with life and the planet, that the earth herself would then, in the larger whole, be a living member of universal creation. So the control of the land is paramount to isolate and control life in this world. The control of the flesh and bonding the flesh through the law and the legal system and the monetized debt and perpetual debt slavery, that's the next thing. Okay. Then being able to harvest the souls so they cannot proceed in any sort of evolutionary path of, moving on into greater life and existence, not a classic sense of dying and going to heaven, but, just in the continuum of life, but being able to capture those souls and recycle them and bind them with monetary debt, and when they die, bind them with karmic debt so that you, quote unquote, own them and can recycle them and put them back into bodies that then continue the bondage and the cycle forever. That was the game plan on a physical, religious, political, monetary, legal, and multidimensional framework. So how do you do that? Well, you define who is on the land and who's not. You create landed gentry who have titles but are bound to the crown or the sovereign through that entitlement. And that created a cesta KV. Yes. The definition, the precise definition, it comes from French, or vie. People say the V-I-E is vie. But cesta K is broken down as 2 words. C'est tu in French means it is you. K means that, essentially. And vie or V means life. C'est tu que vis. It is you who lives. Okay. Or you are the life. Okay. So in terms of law, the exact definition of a sesta KV is the life by which the duration of the estate is measured.
Okay.
So if I'm the sesta KV, which means the living beneficiary, then I hold the title to the land and the estate. And for as long as I'm living, that defines the duration of the estate. So prior to inheriting the line of succession and the title to that estate, or having the standing to have the title and the estate, prior to that, my father was the sesta KV. He was the living beneficiary by which the life measured the duration of that estate. The moment he dies, the new estate and the new living beneficiary has that standing and title and land. It's the same phrase as the king is dead, long live the king.
Yes.
Okay, same thing. Mm-hmm. How can that be? The king's dead, long live the king. Because the minute the king dies, the next king is instantly the living embodiment of the crown, you know?
Yeah.
So, but what happens if a sesta KV goes out to sea and doesn't come back? Well, the Sesta KV Act of 1666 says we have Sesta KVs who have gone to sea and not returned. We need to establish a rule or an act that allows us a proper lawful mechanism to pronounce that Sesta KV dead and thereby settle the estate and move it on to the next Sesta KV or living beneficiary. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense and a really good explanation. Thank you so much, Ken, for that. But you don't know of the Live Life claim.
Okay, but we're not done with Sesta KV.
Oh, whoops, sorry.
Okay, so you have these living beneficiaries holding land and titles and estates who go off to sea and are presumed dead because they don't return. Of course, back then, 400 years ago, they would go to sea, and a lot of those journeys took, 1 or 2 years, and they could come back in 1 or 2 years. So they had to set a time. They set it as 7 years. If he doesn't return in 7 years, we then, by the mechanism of this act, we can pronounce that Sesta KV dead and settle and pass on the estate. Well, it's interesting in 7 years. Again, they like numbers. Well, but why are those numbers there? Well, we also have an estate that we embody, living beings. That's our body. What happens every 7 years? The body changes the actual atomic molecular components of the body, so that 7 years ago, or say today, all the atoms that make up my body were not part of my body 7 years ago. We literally re-embody ourselves every 7 years. But it seems like we're still the same, maybe older, but we're still the same, because there's patterns that are embedded and hidden in the body that keep us stuck in the pattern restricted, compartmentalized, and limited structure that we know as our living estate or our body. So they always reflect reality with the way they create their constructs, they being this global system. So there's a reason why they did 7 years. And there's other things that are embedded in law about 7-year cycles and things like that. So they established 7 years. If the man didn't come back, he was declared dead. The estate was settled. It was passed on to his heir, his son, who then became the title holder and the landed beneficiary and all of that. So that's a continuum of estates. Now they created other estates, like states, like national entities and things like that to hold property. But it all goes back up to that declaration of the papacy over a couple of hundred years in the 13, 14, and 1500s to declare that all land, all flesh, and all souls belong to the vicar of Christ, or the papacy. And so in the age of conquest and civilizing, starting in 1492, they set out to bring all the land, all the flesh, and all the souls into that world global structure and bond and bind the flesh through their legal systems to the perpetual death system. And so how did they then translate that from these recognized aristocracy titled landholders to millions and billions of people on the planet? Well, they created another form of an estate, and that estate is called a decedent estate. It's the same thing effectively as what we call the franchise, the bankrupt franchise. Right. And in the legal system, the word decedent means dying. So we are born, we are registered, which means put under the property registry of the Crown. Yeah. An account is created. We then volunteer to be the office holder of that person, and et cetera. We operate in commerce. Well, from their legal point of view, we are acting as a decedent estate, and we are continually in the process of dying because we're operating that franchise, that decedent estate, in the cult and the world or the realm of death. So, of course, we would be dying from the minute we're born within that system. And so to operate and use that franchise / decedent estate, we have to follow the rules because at birth or moments or days after birth, our true lawful parents abandoned us, abandoned the estate, and turned it over to the default executor, because an estate always has an executor and an administrator. So that new executor by default is the state with all capital letters. So we are operating in a bankrupt estate with executors who delegate their authority to manage the property of the estate, and that delegated authority goes to tax offices, judicial offices, county offices, law enforcement offices, and every time they write a piece of paper, they are writing a debt instrument against the value of the underlying estate and creating a bonded debt that attaches to the living flesh, who's the surety to debt service that debt or pay the fine or do the time and so forth. And incrementally, it's literally cannibalizing our living body and our life force. That's why we're in a state of dying when we're in the matrix, operating through a franchise as a decedent or dying estate that holds property, but that property is held by the executor, which can do whatever it wants. Yeah. You know,
it's so rude, isn't it? That's a really rude act, isn't it? I mean,
well, it's just part of the process.
Yeah,
I mean, part of the creation of this global structure and a global estate, so that the body becomes property of the decedent estate, and therefore they can create rules because you've volunteered to operate in their system. So they create rules called codes.
Yes,
and the word code is short for the word codicil. The word codicil is the adding of an additional statement or instruction to a will. Okay.
Nice.
So when we, in normal flow of life, we grow up, we get married, we have children, we create some assets, and then we leave a will. And the will says, my friend Bob is going to be the executor of my estate when I die. So I die, Bob steps in, he takes control of the estate, and as the executor, he has two things that he does. He gathers in all the data of the liabilities and the assets that belong to the estate. And the second thing is he settles the liabilities so that what remains for the beneficiary can be passed to the beneficiary.
Nice.
In the meantime, since we're operating a not completely dead estate, but not an alive state, where all titles to the property belong to the estate as the executor, then the administrators or executors of that decedent estate can do whatever they want to issue codes that bind the will of the abandoned estate, because we never expressed our will. We abandoned it, and now we're just simply attached debt servants to the estate. We get limited use of it. We get to live in the house if our estate or franchise has the name on the title, but we must service it. We must pay the mortgage, which is a pledge of death. We must pay the insurance. We must do the maintenance and all of that. And when it's all said and done, the value of that state is constantly be restructured with all the economic vicissitudes of life, and it's cannibalizing everything we create. It's taking all of that, shoving it up to the top where the wealth and the equity has been concentrated, and it does very little to sustain, just barely above maintaining breath and life, to do anything for the vast majority of the decedent estates on the planet. They're just feeding troughs and harvesting mechanisms to take the life force and the production of value out of those estates. So that's a decedent estate, and we're bound to it. We're bound to the codes because the abandoned estate, under the authority of the state as executor, can add more codicils over and over, to where in the U.S. you got 100 million codicils or codes that obligate the executor or the trustee of the estate to apply to the operation of the estate until the liabilities are completely settled and closed, and the value or the property remaining can be transferred to the beneficiary. But that never happens in our lifetime because we're continually creating more liabilities. We're creating more debt, and they can never be resolved. So status correction is simply stated as declaring yourself to be who you are as a true living being, no longer wishing to maintain the mistake of having abandoned the estate and being attached to it as the servant, the debt servicer, and the bonded surety. And when we separate from that decedent estate, it becomes deceased. Yes. Now we can properly settle all liabilities and close out that estate and proceed forward with the value that we did carry over into our now new estate in the private, not attached to everything like that, and then continue to build value and without attachment to that death and dying system.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, and sorry for interrupting in the middle of it.
That's all right. So I don't know what a living claim is, but it sounds like somebody is doing something along those lines. Yes. As far as making a claim that I'm in the living and I claim the estate. And that's a partial understanding, a partial solution, because they don't have the status or the standing to state that claim. Uh-huh. If you claim the estate, you claim I'm living, but you haven't done the groundwork. You haven't properly done the steps to separate and have the standing to make that claim, then it's just water off the duck's back. It just falls on deaf ears. And see, here's a very simple way where we can see where this is built into the entire Judeo-Christian Western construct of the geopolitical and banking monetary system on the planet. That it's a very simple thing, and that you can find in the New Testament. It's Matthew 8, chapter 8, verse 22, where the statement made by Jesus in that storyline is, let the dead tend to the dead. And preceding that, the storyline is Jesus is there and he's healing people and blah, 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 but ultimately saying heal yourself. And just before that statement about the dead, one of the disciples said to him, I have to go off and tend to my father because he's dying. And then he says, let the dead tend to the dead.
Yes.
And what that really means, it's a commercial instruction. If you want to go into the realm of death and tend to the dead and dying, you're going to be stuck in the realm of the dead. Yeah. If you wish to remove yourself, you must let the dead and all these judicial officers and tax officers and everybody else in the public system, they are dead because they're operating through dead franchises. They have taken on pledges of death and they have attached themselves for benefits to the realm of the dead. So let them tend to the dead. Let them settle the liabilities. Let them settle their estate that they created that we inadvertently and mistakenly attached ourselves to. That's saying correct your status, let the dead tend to the dead, know how to remove yourself from that, and know how to instruct or command the dead to settle the elements of the dead. Nice. The very next verse, suddenly they're in a boat. You know, they're there with the crowds, they're doing all that stuff I described. Next thing, they're in a boat. What kind of boat? A boat that's on the Sea of Commerce. A boat such as a Cesta KV, who has gone to went out to sea and was presumed dead or lost at sea. What is the Sea of Commerce? The Sea of Commerce is commercial paper that is bound to a surety, and it's in the form of debt. And when you're in debt, you're underwater. Yeah. Okay, you're not liquid. When you are solvent and you have liquidity to flow like the current of a river through the banks of natural order, you are solvent. You are living. You are the living beneficiary, and you can truly make that living claim. But if you haven't taken care of the underlying factors, you're, shouting in a wind tunnel. Yeah. So in that story, next thing you know, they're in a boat. The boat is the commercial vessel that we float on the Sea of Commerce, trying to stay afloat. And then the story says, then a storm came up, whirling around, disrupting and creating chaos and confusion and instability of my vessel on the Sea of Commerce. And the disciples are in the boat, and they don't know how to settle the waters. They don't know how to settle the storm. And so thus they're not a master. They haven't mastered themselves as living beings who have the capacity to settle anything that comes to them. So they have to turn to the master who is sleeping. It means it's a metaphor. The master within us is sleeping because we haven't awakened to and gained the capacity through knowledge and education and everything we've talked about to properly and lawfully settle all claims against us and calm the waters of commerce upon which we are floating, as in being in the matrix but not of it. We have to settle the waters. So that's a metaphor. The disciples don't have a master. The master is sleeping. So they wake up the master, which means in our process we have to wake up our own master, the master that we actually can be. We used to be, but we went asleep. We allowed ourselves to be submerged in the ocean or the sea of death and debt. So they wake up the master. The master, yawns, wakes up, looks around, says, you guys didn't know how to settle the waters. He goes like that, makes a command. He settles the waters because he's a master. Mm-hmm. He's not a savior. He's not some guy from the sky who came in and said, just, leave it to me, I'll do it all for you. No, that's the bullshit construct to get people to abnegate and abrogate their inner mastery and power to an externalized power and authority in state and in government, state as government, in church as the priest who controls the law and binds their flesh. So when we awaken the master and we take the steps to learn and integrate what we need to do, then we can settle the waters of commerce that we were previously lost at sea within. And then the fourth section of the Cesta KV Act says that when the living beneficiary returns, having been lost, returns to standing on the land, claims the estate, all the profit and proceeds accrued to the estate under the control of the executors must revert back to the living beneficiary. And so we have that power and capacity to do that. It's in the law.
Yeah.
The law actually does form the bondage, but it inherently has the remedy and the solution. And so that's the path, that if one chooses to be free in this world and return to that standing and have mastery and then have capacity to actually do something real, to start rebuilding this world and cleaning it up and progressively bringing the means and resources for the 4 or 5 billion disenfranchised people living on the edge of starvation and existence, that we can actually transform this world. But we're not going to transform it if we're debt servants and bonded sureties. We must ignite the master, and we do that with education and then application and taking the steps to calm the waters, settle the liabilities, and become a living beneficiary in our own estate, which is our living body. That's a landed estate.
Brilliant. And that is what we're meant to do. That is what we have to do. And do you know what we have to do now is to call this nearly 2 hours, and it was over 2.5 hours with the technical difficulty we had earlier, and maybe continue the next time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good place to stop. Yeah. We covered a lot. We certainly did. We planted some seeds for the next conversation, and so we're good.
Brilliant. So it'll be early May the 6th, I think, is the first Wednesday in May. So
okay.
we'll organise it for then. And Ken Scott, honestly, the information is brilliant. The future of all of us can be rosier if we get our acts together, I suppose, changing our status, belong to a private contract association like Pantera, and learn from people as wonderful as you and Gemstone University. I want to thank you so much, Ken.
Great, thanks. And let me just one more thing to close off. So we've made reference in all these conversations, and again here, to Panterra as a private society in Gemstone University, which has its website. And up until now, people could just step up, go to Gemstone University, find the button that says join now, and do what the simple steps to become a member and have access to everything we've talked about inside Gemstone University. Right now, we are going through a major expansion of what we're doing, like we talked about earlier, to mobilize our resources and start doing the projects that we have and so forth. So for the next 90 days, we are not taking new members. But if anybody's interested and really wants to be part of what we're doing, go to Gemstone University. There's still a lot there. There's also more things on Gemstone University on YouTube, plenty to digest in those accessible areas. But if you want to be a member and be part of what we're doing, it will be set up so that you won't automatically become a member, but you could submit. And there'll be instructions and guidelines. Submit what we have there, and it'll be up in the next couple of days. And well, actually, by the time this airs on Wednesday, it'll be up. So, just follow instructions, and then we would be happy to receive that. And then it will be reviewed by one of our teams. And then after that 90-day period, we will be contacting everybody who wishes to be a member. We're separating certain functions, and we're concentrating on those people who really are committed to being active in this work. And what we're going to do is we're going to export all the foundational education into a new site that's going to be free for anybody, whereas now you have to be a member with donation. And we're going to create another society called the Gemstone Global Media Alliance. We're going to build a global platform. We have the technical wherewithal, we have the resources, and we have the knowledge how to do this. And we're going to build a decentralized global platform that everybody can co-create. and be part of media and exchange and information, which is Gemstone Global Educational Media. So in this 90 days, we're restructuring and we're building towards creating that platform, exporting all of the private membership information and education to the media platform that anybody can access, and lay the foundation with everything we've talked about here, and then make, a well-informed, conscious decision to, yes, I want to continue, and thus I want to apply to be a member of the private society and be part of building everything. So all of that will be laid out and made available over the next 90 days.
Brilliant. And hopefully we'll have you back in about a month's time as well, Ken. So that's great.
Well, we don't have to hope.